Hello and welcome to my second lecture on hallucinogens. Last time I considered LSD, which is in many ways the most famous of the hallucinogenic drugs, but by far the only one. In this lecture I'm going to consider two other hallucinogens. The first is mushrooms, and really here I'm not even talking about all psychedelic or hallucinogenic mushrooms, but really psilocybin bearing mushrooms. I will talk a little bit about their history, a little bit about some of the acute effects and the chronic effects of psilocybin in these sources. And then in the second part of the lecture I'm going to talk about MDMA, or ecstasy, or sometimes more recently called Molly. And I'll again talk about the history and the pharmacology and the acute effects and the chronic effects and some of the risks potentially associated with using this drug. As I said in the last lecture, hallucinogens are this really broad and kind of diverse and very interesting group of drugs. In thinking of these lectures, I was very tempted to go into great length about all the different kinds of hallucinogenic drugs out there, but really you could do a whole semester's worth of teaching on just the hallucinogens, and you'd only be scratching the surface. By picking LSD, psilocybin, and MDMA, I think I'm kind of covering some of the more popularly used hallucinogens and maybe some of the ones that I think are a little bit easier to access in terms of the information we have about them. Anyway, I hope you'll find this stuff interesting. Let's get started. First off, let's talk about mushrooms. And again, to be clear, there are a lot of mushrooms out there that if you take them can exert some really powerful sometimes hallucinogenic, sometimes neurotoxic effects on your body. I'm really going to limit myself to just one group of those, the psilocybin mushrooms, but they are among the more popular psychedelic mushrooms out there. So what do we know about the history of these plants? Well, not really plants, they're fungi. The genus Psilocybe, it's a genus of fungi, a genus of mushrooms that all produce different levels of different alkaloids, and for our purposes the one that we're really interested in is called psilocybin. Now, these mushrooms are native to Mexico and to Central America. They can also be found elsewhere, including in North America, and we have reason to believe that historically they were part of different ceremonies by peoples who are indigenous to that region. So for instance, if we look at what we know about the Aztec civilization, there is archaeological evidence of the use of sacred mushrooms that may be psilocybin mushrooms, or they may be some other sort of mushrooms, and the very difficult to pronounce word Teonanacatl, gosh, that's not even close, or God's flesh, comes down to us as kind of some linguistic evidence that people consumed these mushrooms and perhaps experienced hallucinogenic or maybe religious tinged experiences as a result. Now, to be clear, in other parts of the world, other types of mushrooms and other fungi were consumed for similar psychedelic effects. Right here, we're focusing on psilocybin mushrooms, and again, they're native to the Americas. They were known, as is often the case when we talk about drugs, they were known by ancient and indigenous peoples for hundreds, if not thousands of years. They were used apparently in ceremonial or religious contexts. However, a lot of the knowledge about these mushrooms was lost during the Spanish conquest of the 1500s, when the Aztec and other civilizations were destroyed, and because of the conquest and because of the spread of Christianity, the idea of the religious use of these drugs somewhat disappeared, or rather went kind of underground. So the history of this drug goes way, way back, but then kind of disappears, or again goes underground for a long period of time, all the way up until the 1950s. And so in a sense, you know, it's incorrect to call this the discovery of mushrooms. It was the discovery of mushrooms, or psilocybin mushrooms, by Americans and by other white people. But if we go up into the 1950s, we meet interesting people like George Wasson. He was a kind of a traveler. He was kind of an ethnobotanist, in the sense that he was interested in the plants and fungi that different people around the world consumed for different reasons, and he was invited to participate on a trip to Mexico in a mushroom eating ceremony. And he actually wrote about this experience in Life magazine in 1957. And there's some really interesting descriptions come down to us from this experience. Wassman describes eating the magic mushrooms and then reports later, quote, "It permits you to travel backwards and forwards in time, to enter other planes of existence, even to know God. Your body lies in the darkness, heavy as lead, but your spirit seems to soar and to leave the hut. And with the speed of thought you travel and you listen, and in time and space you're accompanied by the shaman singing. At last you know what the ineffable is and what ecstasy means. Ecstasy! The mind harks back to the origin of that word. For the Greeks, ecstasy meant the flight of the soul from your body. Can you describe, or can you find a better word to describe this state?" So in this writing and in other writings, he talked about these kind of amazing experiences that he'd had while consuming these mushrooms that seemed to transport him, or at least transport his mind, into totally different places and have him experiencing the world around him in profoundly different ways than he would without the experience of this drug. Now, these reports got a lot of people's attention, including our friend Albert Hofmann, the Swiss chemist who you'll remember synthesized LSD, or he first isolated it from ergot and then was able to synthesize it in his laboratory. He basically did the same thing with psilocybin. He was able to isolate it from psilocybin-bearing mushrooms and then later develop a synthetic version of it. And a little bit like LSD, there was kind of a popularity or a curiosity around this drug, psilocybin. It wasn't something that seemed to have any obvious medical use. It didn't seem to, eliminate pain, or it didn't seem to make people particularly sleepy or particularly awake. So it's not the sort of thing that drug companies were in a big rush to market, too widely, to doctors and hospitals, etc. But it did seem to have some potentially therapeutic purposes because of the really profound ways in which it seemed to change people's thinking or their perception of the world around them. And a bit like we saw with LSD, there was a history or a period of time in history when people began to experiment, formally or informally, with the use of psilocybin. One of these people was Walter Pahnke, an American psychiatrist and minister who in 1963 conducted what we call the Good Friday experiment. In this experiment, he worked with a group of seminary students, people who were training to become ministers, and he gave half of them psilocybin in a capsule form and half of them vitamin B to form a comparison group. And those who received psilocybin, by and large, reported profound changes in the way they experienced the world around them, changes that had kind of a mystical or religious tone to them, which is very similar, I suppose, to what Wasson had described in his non-experimental, kind of anecdotal reporting earlier on. Now, by the standards of today's science, this probably wasn't a great experiment because the people in the study, the students, knew which group they were going into. The folks who were getting the psilocybin knew they were getting psilocybin, and the folks who weren't getting the psilocybin knew they weren't getting the psilocybin. So there wasn't a really good comparison between actually getting the drug and not getting the drug while controlling for the expectation of having a drug experience. So it might just be the case that the people who knew they were having psilocybin were kind of inclined to feel that they were going to have a religious experience, whereas the people who weren't getting psilocybin knew they weren't and were maybe a bit bummed out about that or depressed about that and knew they weren't going to have a particularly religious experience. Now, we'll see in the future, or rather we'll see in present time, there is ongoing research with psilocybin that more or less comports with this early research. But it's worth pointing out now, this early research had some flaws in it, but did seem to kind of back up the general idea that something about taking psilocybin, maybe like taking some of the other hallucinogenic drugs, seems to change people's perception of the world around them, often in a way which encourages them to feel kind of mystical or religious in terms of their connection to the world. Another person who got kind of interested in psilocybin at this time was our friend Aldous Huxley, who we met in the last lecture, assuming you didn't already know about him. As you recall, I hope, he wrote different pieces of fiction that were inspired by drugs. He wrote a book called The Island in 1962, which is kind of a utopian story, meaning it's about a kind of an idealized civilization in which people consume mushrooms for a form of spiritual enlightenment. So sort of drawing on the interest then generally in psychedelic drugs, perhaps particularly in the use of psilocybin mushrooms and other psychedelic mushrooms. And as we saw with LSD, this type of writing further kind of popularized the idea of psychedelic drugs or hallucinogenic drugs to the broader population. So, in some ways, the story of psilocybin kind of parallels the story of LSD. So with that little bit of history in mind, let's skip ahead now and talk about the current use of mushrooms. What do we know about people's current use of hallucinogenic mushrooms, perhaps particularly psilocybin-bearing mushrooms? Well, unfortunately, we don't have a lot of really good data on people's rates of use, because most surveys don't ask specifically about mushrooms, or they just group them in with other hallucinogens. So for example, if we look at the Monitoring the Future survey for 2014, the lifetime use of hallucinogens that aren't LSD among 12th graders is about 5%. So about 5% of 12th graders will say that they've ever tried a hallucinogen that wasn't LSD, and this could include mushrooms, but it could also include other hallucinogenic drugs that we haven't yet talked about. If we look at some of our trends over the years, we see kind of a basic pattern that mirrors the overall pattern of drug use that we've seen over the years, where there was kind of a high point, no pun intended, for drug use in the late 1970s or mid to late 1970s, declines through the 1980s, kind of a rebound in the 90s, and then a kind of a tabling off and decline in the early 2000s. And that's generally true for most drugs. It's true for, in this case, hallucinogens that aren't LSD. Again, if we look at National Survey of Drug Use and Health, here they just generally include hallucinogens altogether, and so this includes LSD, but also includes psilocybin mushrooms. Like we saw in the last lecture, the lifetime prevalence among all people aged 12 or older is around 16% or so, meaning about 15% of the population will report having ever used a hallucinogenic drug. Now again, this includes not just psilocybin mushrooms, but other mushrooms, also LSD, also DMT, also mescaline, also many other drugs that we haven't even talked about. The basic picture I get from this is that hallucinogens, including hallucinogenic mushrooms, are not incredibly rarely used in the population, but neither are they very commonly used. The rates aren't as low as, say, heroin, but they're not as high as, say, marijuana, or certainly much, much lower than something like alcohol use. So with that stuff in mind, let's move forward and talk a little bit about the pharmacology of psilocybin. Well, psilocybin is a water-soluble chemical, and so it absorbs pretty easily into the body through the stomach. Most people who use psilocybin are taking it orally, either by chewing up dehydrated psilocybin mushrooms, like the psilocybin mexicana here pictured, or by brewing up a tea made from ground up mushrooms. Again, because it's water soluble, you can brew it into a tea and then drink the tea, or consume it mixed in with other food, like ground up and put in spaghetti sauce and eaten with a plate of spaghetti or whatever else. Not sure where I got that idea, but I'm sure someone's done it. So again, basically oral administration, absorption through the stomach. The drug distributes pretty easily throughout the body. The peak effects of the drug occur maybe about 1 or 2 hours into the experience, and there's relatively slow elimination of the drug, meaning that the effects of a psilocybin high can last 6, 8, 10 hours or more. So it's a little bit like LSD in the sense that once you use this drug, you're on a trip or on a journey that's going to last you quite a long time, which could be good or it could be bad, depending a lot on the person and the setting in which he or she is using the drug. You should also note that there's a lot of variability in the experiences that people have when they use psychedelic mushrooms, in part because the level of psilocybin, as well as other hallucinogenic alkaloids, varies quite a lot from mushroom to mushroom, both in terms of different species of mushrooms within the genus psilocybe, and also just how much a given mushroom has developed those alkaloids. Moreover, if you buy mushrooms, if you buy them illegally, which you would have to do in this country, you can't actually be sure that what you're getting really is a psilocybin mushroom or really any other sort of hallucinogenic mushroom. It may well just be an inert mushroom, like you might buy at the store, that's been sprayed down with LSD or with some other synthetic hallucinogen. So it's very difficult to study what is typical for users of psilocybin, at least psilocybin in its mushroom form, because it's an illegal drug, and all illegal drugs have essentially no regulation for purity and sort of quality of production. So high variability. With all that in mind, what are the acute effects of mushrooms? What goes on in your body? What goes on in your brain when you consume these drugs? Well, this is a lot like LSD, and that makes sense because LSD and psilocybin are very similar in terms of how they interact with the body and the brain. So similar, as I mentioned in the last lecture, that you can develop a pretty robust cross-tolerance between the two. How that looks in the periphery is just basic sympathetic activation. As I said with LSD, this isn't as strong as we would see with a stimulant drug, but there is increased heart rate and increased blood pressure, dilated pupils, elevated body temperature, increased respiration, etc., etc. So it gives you a mild kick, at least early on in the experience, although again, not so much as you would see if you were using cocaine or some other stimulant. Within the central nervous system, psilocybin breaks down very quickly into psilocin, which is a somewhat more fat-soluble molecule which gets into your brain pretty easily. It's similar to LSD in terms of how it affects the brain, particularly the serotonin transporters and receptors. It's so similar that we have a pretty robust cross-tolerance, as I mentioned earlier. It acts a lot like LSD, but it tends to be a lot less potent than LSD. Maybe a very small fraction, 1/200th as potent, according to one pharmacology textbook that I have open in front of me right now, as is LSD. That may be in part because LSD is just a ridiculously potent drug. It's one of the most potent drugs we know in terms of how strong an effect we get from it from such small doses. In terms of psilocybin and psilocin, relatively low doses of it produce kind of a gentle, relaxed sensation. Higher doses produce the kind of distortions in perception and maybe even frank hallucinations that we might see with LSD. Anecdotally, if you talk to people who use hallucinogenic drugs, they'll sometimes describe the mushroom high, and here we're assuming they mean the psilocybin mushroom high, as a kind of a more gentle or more kind of low-key hallucinogenic experience than an LSD high or a high from other hallucinogenic drugs. And that kind of makes sense because the drug psilocybin and psilocin, they're much less potent than is LSD. So those are the acute effects of the drug. What about the chronic or long-term effects of this drug? Well, as I hinted earlier, there is ongoing research with psilocybin. A lot of it in this country has been conducted at Johns Hopkins University. These are just generally known as the Johns Hopkins studies. There was one in 2006, one in 2008. I'm pretty sure they've more recently published as well. What's nice about these studies are that they use proper double-blind procedures. And if you think back to earlier in the semester when we talked about experimental methods, in this context what we're doing is we're bringing people into our laboratory or into the hospital and we're assigning them to either receive psilocybin or to receive methylphenidate, so Ritalin. Now here this is valuable because both psilocybin and methylphenidate are going to give you a slightly aroused feeling. So methylphenidate, Ritalin, acts as a reasonable placebo for psilocybin. It's going to give you that kind of sympathetic activation, but not going to give you the hallucinogen or the hallucinogenic effects. Now people are brought into the laboratory are blind in the sense that they don't know if the capsule they're receiving is going to include psilocybin or it's going to include methylphenidate. The researcher who is in the room with them is also blind in the sense that he or she doesn't know what's in that capsule. So he or she can't subtly hint or even accidentally suggest to the person that, oh, you're going to have an interesting experience with this pill, or oh, this will be over pretty quickly, it's just methylphenidate. they're double blind. The person taking the drug is blind, the person giving the drug is blind. The only person or only people who know the reality of which person has been assigned to which group are the folks who are directing the study, and they're not in the room at the time. So it's a relatively, it's the gold standard of doing pharmacological research that hopefully lets us see whether the experiences that people have under psilocybin really have to do with the actual effect of the drug rather than some sort of expectation that the person may hold for what's going to happen, or some sort of expectation that may be communicated to them by the researcher or the experimenter in the room. Anyway, this research has been ongoing. It's really fascinating. I'm going to put a video link on Blackboard to a YouTube clip about this research. But the basic follow-up is that the experiences that people have tend to be fairly positive, and even at a 2-month follow-up, that is 2 months after participation is over, when people are brought back to the laboratory and just interviewed and asked to describe, well, what do you think about your experience? Has it changed your life? Have you thought about things differently? Most folks who are in the study report a positive experience, and interestingly, many people report kind of a spiritually significant experience occurred when they used psilocybin. This is something that to me is just kind of interesting. That is that something about hallucinogenic drugs generally, or maybe about psilocybin even particularly, seem to inspire a kind of a mystical or religious feeling among people. I don't know why that is, and this is just me speculating at this point, but it seems that a lot of religious practice, whether it's deep prayer or meditation or kind of contemplation or deep reading of religious texts, seems to put you in a state of mind where you break down barriers between yourself and the world around you. So perhaps if you meditate for a very long time, you have a sense of the enhanced connectivity between you and the world, or you see people around you as not very different. They're part of you, or they're related to you because of God or because of whatever it is that you believe in. Now, I imagine for people who meditate or pray for long periods of time, this realization or this sense occurs over a long period of dedicated practice and patient thinking and praying and meditating. What may happen in the case of hallucinogens is within the space of a couple hours, you're put into a state of mind that really forces you to see the world differently, and that maybe challenges your understanding of yourself as a discrete human being entirely divorced from the world around you, and your consciousness as being this kind of unassailable aspect of your mind. You rather see yourself as more connected to the world around you, and your consciousness is more temporary or impermanent. Again, I can only speculate here, not being a deeply religious person myself and not having ever used hallucinogenic drugs. But it does seem to be this interesting and kind of tantalizing idea that something about hallucinogens plugs people into kind of a potentially religious experience. By the way, this is just a picture from one of the Johns Hopkins studies, and you can see here there's a patient who's been brought into a room. It's clearly a relaxing room. There's some sort of mystical imagery around this person, including a mushroom statue and some meditation cushions, and the person is being monitored by experimenters and nurses. We should say here that this person may be taking psilocybin, or she may be, or he, can't quite tell with the headphones and mask, may be taking methylphenidate. Either way, they're going to be in the same room with the same people in the same pictures, so as not to bias someone to think that he was receiving methylphenidate or he was receiving psilocybin. An interesting picture. Anyway, part of this research that's going on at Johns Hopkins is in connection with a research program that's looking at how to treat people who are suffering from depression, especially people who are suffering from depression related to cancer diagnosis. Back when I was on my internship for clinical psychology, I worked with people who were newly diagnosed with cancer, or who were undergoing chemotherapy, or frankly were just dying from cancer. And as you might guess, or as you might know from your own experience of your family members and loved ones, rates of depression are elevated among people in this group. And it can be really heartbreaking, because it's bad enough to have cancer, it's worse to feel depressed about having cancer, although it's entirely understandable. And thus there is some interest in providing treatments that can help people feel more comfortable, help people feel less depressed, perhaps help people feel more reconciled to the inevitability of their death, with or without cancer. And psilocybin seems to be helpful for some folks. Again, I'll link to some videos that sort of document a little bit of this, including a video about this man here who describes his experience with cancer and also with psilocybin. Now, outside of this research, there doesn't seem to be a lot of long-term negative effects of using psilocybin. It doesn't seem to be a particularly toxic drug to the body. Like LSD, it doesn't seem to really be damaging to you. However, it may be disorienting or even frightening to use psychedelic drugs. That's true of LSD. It's also true of psilocybin. It's true of the other drugs that I haven't even mentioned yet. So I certainly don't want to argue that all drugs are safe, or that even that psilocybin is safe. It seems to have some interesting therapeutic potential. It seems to have maybe some religious potential, if you want to think about it that way. But it's worth noting that there are risks involved in using any drug. And with that in mind, I'm actually going to transition now and talk about a different drug, and that drug is MDMA. So what do we know about the history of MDMA? Unlike the other drugs that I've covered, this drug, well, unlike the other drugs I've covered except for the sedatives, this drug was developed synthetically from the get-go. It wasn't based on an existing plant or fungus alkaloid. In 1912, a German chemist named Anton Kolsch synthesized 3,4-methylene dioxymethamphetamine. And if you just look at that name, you can see that it's actually a form of amphetamine. Recall that back in the early part of the 20th century, there was a lot of enthusiasm for conducting chemical research to kind of develop new forms of amphetamines, new forms of stimulants, methamphetamines. This is a methylated amphetamine that's not methamphetamine, but different in some shape, form, or fashion. Like I said, it was developed early on in the 1900s. It was actually patented by the drug company Merck, although they didn't really have a lot of use for it because it didn't seem to provide as strong a stimulant boost as other existing drugs at the time. So it was like, they told poor Anton, the chemist, hey, good job, nice new chemical, but it's not really as good as the existing chemicals we have, so we patented it. We're not really going to do anything with it, though. And poor Anton Kolsch actually died in World War I, so he's remembered to us. Perhaps he was a good guy personally. He was a good chemist, but he developed a drug that didn't really make him famous at the time and didn't really do anything at the time. After World War I, it was taken by the Allies as kind of a spoil of war. So basically, it was available both in Europe and in America. It was known about, but not really a lot was done with it for most of its early history. In the 1950s, the Army conducted experiments using it, because back then the Army and the CIA were conducting experiments with all sorts of drugs, and they really found very few useful effects of it. Again, it was a stimulant that wasn't really as good as the other stimulants out there, so it didn't seem to have a lot of real applications. That is, until it was kind of rediscovered in the 1970s by a guy named Alexander Shulgin. Shulgin, who actually recently died, is in a way sort of sad, is an American pharmacologist who he kind of rediscovered MDMA in that he was looking over old chemical formulae for different drugs that had been discovered throughout the 20th century and had been patented, and he would mix up these different drugs and then conduct simple research experiments on them. And he published some of these experiments, including experiments where he took the drug himself. He took MDMA himself. And what was interesting or really important for us is that Shulgin noticed not just that there are some stimulant effects from MDMA, which had been noticed before, but he also noticed that there are some interesting other psychological effects, particularly changes in the way people who were taking the drug felt about themselves and about other people. And even more particularly, a sense that people got when they were on MDMA that they were more caring or compassionate towards themselves and towards others. Now, Shulgin had colleagues during this time, this was in the 1970s and into the early 1980s, who were psychotherapists, and they were very interested in this drug because it seemed to help people to be able to talk about their emotions better. People who took MDMA could describe more openly or perhaps even more honestly how they were feeling, especially if they're having difficult or threatening feelings. So, this was the 1970s, and in the 1980s, there were people who were suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, for instance, from being in combat during the Vietnam War. Part of a lot of psychotherapy for people with PTSD involves revisiting difficult experiences, revisiting difficult emotions, and trying to talk about them rather than being frightened by them. That's easy to say, but it is certainly very hard to do. And there was a lot of enthusiasm for MDMA as a drug that maybe could help people talk about those feelings. There's also enthusiasm for MDMA among people who were marriage and family, or couples and family therapists, because, as anyone knows who's been in a relationship that involves fighting, it can be hard to talk to someone when you're angry. It can be hard to talk openly about feelings when you're feeling hurt or threatened. And so people who work with couples, who work with families, were very interested in the idea that MDMA could help people break down some of their barriers, talk more openly about their feelings, and hopefully achieve some benefit from therapy. So a little bit like how we saw with LSD, there was this idea that maybe using this drug could help people get at stuff in their mind that they were having a hard time getting at without the drug. Particularly in the case of MDMA, emotions, feelings that people have about themselves and about others. So that was kind of the psychotherapeutic interest in MDMA. There was also around this time kind of a surge in recreational use of the drug. Some of this can actually be traced to a really interesting fellow named Michael Clegg. He was a former seminarian who popularized the use of MDMA and sold it mostly in the Dallas area of Texas during the 1980s. And to be clear, Clegg discovered this drug, or was introduced to it, because as part of his training in seminary, he learned sort of couples and counseling and sort of marital counseling and psychotherapy counseling techniques, and heard about MDMA. MDMA was legal during this time in history, and he took it himself. He gave it to people he knew, and he felt that it was really nice. He felt kind of warm and happy about himself. He felt like he was in love with other people, and so he figured, let's sell this stuff. And the history of Clegg is sort of an interesting history, because for a while it's almost like if you could imagine someone who's like a drug kingpin, but selling an entirely legal drug. There's this period of time in America, especially in Texas, where MDMA was super popular and super legal, and people would just take some ecstasy and go to like a country bar and do some line dancing and have a good old time, I suppose. By the way, Clegg is the person who's credited with developing the name ecstasy, or naming ecstasy for the drug MDMA. Well, anyway, as we see with the history of so many drugs, after an initial period of enthusiasm, there's a period of concern. Concern over the unregulated use of the drug, and concern over the possibility of overdose. In the case of MDMA, there were, during the early 1980s, a handful of deaths associated with using MDMA. People died from hyperthermia, that's where your body becomes too hot, and also from dehydration. Typically what was happening is people were going to bars or dance clubs or dance festivals, and they were taking MDMA. They were feeling a lot of energy from the drug, and also a lot of happiness about being dancing and out with all these other people. They would just dance and socialize for long periods of time while getting hotter and hotter and hotter, not noticing this, and probably not drinking enough water. And over time, if you overheat your body, you will damage various organ systems, and you can ultimately die from that. That's certainly what seems to have happened with folks who were taking MDMA, at least some small fraction of people who were taking MDMA. There was also some little bit of early research on the potential risks of use of the drug, and in very quick fashion, not in 1970, I forget exactly which year it was, but in the early 1980s, MDMA was added to Schedule 1 of the Comprehensive Drug Control Act. In a way, you might scratch your head and think, wait a sec, does MDMA have some medical or psychotherapeutic uses? Perhaps it does. Does it have a high potential for abuse? I'm not so sure it does. Why is MDMA on Schedule 1 instead of maybe Schedule 3 or even Schedule 2? I don't know. And this is just another example of how the illegality or legality of a drug has a lot more to do with perceptions of risk than actual empirical evidence of risk. And it just happens to be the case that in the early 80s, there's a real push to take this new drug, MDMA, which seemed so tantalizing with its possibilities, and make it very illegal very quickly. And that's basically what happened. So once MDMA was scheduled, legal use of it, of course, stopped immediately. and illegal use of the drug began. Organized crime outfits produced MDMA in Europe and smuggled it back into America. And interestingly, as we saw with LSD, there was this period of time in the 80s and 90s where there was a kind of an overlap between the use of psychedelic drugs, including LSD, including MDMA, and electronic dance music. And if you're a fan of techno or house or whatever it is people listen to these days, this probably makes some sense. If you go to a club or an outdoor festival and you listen to this kind of repetitive, sort of hypnotic music, it may be helpful or enjoyable to be on a drug which is going to really profoundly change the way you see the world around you. The music seems more interesting, the lasers seem more interesting. Maybe in the case of MDMA, you feel kind of empathic and connected to all the people and the other dancers around you. It's also the case that just there were people who were bringing electronic music to America from Europe, and a lot of the folks who were setting up illegal and kind of semi-legal parties in Chicago or in Los Angeles or in New York were, found a good way to bring drugs into the country illegally and sell them very quickly to large groups of people. So for reasons that probably have to do with art and reasons that have to do with commerce, there was this kind of overlap between dance music and ecstasy, and dance music and LSD, and dance music and some of these other drugs that we can talk about. In the 1990s, the National Institute of Drug Abuse, that's part of the National Institutes of Health, a research organization that's funded by the federal government, published a series of warnings in advertisements called the Your Brain on Ecstasy campaign that emphasized the risks associated with using MDMA. And particularly, they made use of the well, it wasn't totally new, but at the time it seemed very new, techniques in brain imaging that were becoming popular then. So pictured here, you can see an image taken from a positron emission tomography scan or PET scan showing different levels of brain activity. In the left, it's a normal brain, and in the right, it's a brain of someone who's used ecstasy. And this sort of discrepancy between these two images led to this phrase, the ecstasy, or this idea that was popularized in a phrase, the ecstasy created holes in the brain, that somehow turned your brain into Swiss cheese. I remember this from the 1990s, being in high school and later in college, just seeing these type of advertisements and this campaign and being told by healthcare professionals and teachers that MDMA was this drug which seemed so great, it could make you feel so good, but secretly it was destroying your brain. We'll return to that idea and that research a little bit later in this lecture because I think it's worth some consideration. But suffice it to say, by the mid to late 1990s, about the time use of hallucinogenic drugs, including ecstasy, was peaking, there was this real pushback to advertise and to emphasize the risks or apparent risks associated with the drug. And again, we'll talk about that more a little bit later. But before we get there, I want to address the issue of drug purity, and the reason I want to is because recently, and recently meaning in the last couple of years, MDMA has had kind of a second life, or a yet again kind of resurgence in popularity in the form of a dust or powder of MDMA rather than the pill form which it was typically given in previous years. And it's sometimes called Molly, and it's sold as a powder, and it certainly has a certain popularity both in pop culture and songs. You sometimes hear people referencing it, and the popularity of Molly has a lot to do with the perception of how pure or impure ecstasy is. And the simple truth is that most MDMA that you would buy illegally, because of course it's all illegal, is not really just MDMA. It's a mixture of other drugs. Those could be amphetamines, dextromethorphan, synthetic LSD, other just random stuff. Again, I remember in the late 1990s and the early 2000s living in Florida and having a friend whose boyfriend was a pretty significant drug dealer, and I remember asking her about ecstasy at the time because we used to talk about electronic music like techno and trance music and all that stuff. And I said, is it that can people still get ecstasy? And she said, yeah, you kind of can, but you kind of can't, because if you're buying a pill that your dealer is telling you is ecstasy, in all likelihood there's little or no real MDMA in there. It's a mixture of other cheaper drugs that are easier to get and easier to pack together. This is good for the drug dealer because it makes his job or her job easier. It's bad for the user because, of course, you don't know what you're taking or how much of it you're taking, and there are always risks of dangerous interactions between drugs. And I'll provide some links on Blackboard, but essentially research that's been done backs up this anecdotal account that I've just given you. When people voluntarily give over drugs that they've purchased, or when police seize drugs and do them and send them in for chemical analysis, typically a pill of so-called ecstasy or so-called MDMA has little or no real MDMA in it, and instead is just a mixture of other synthetic drugs that mimic, maybe, the apparent effects of MDMA. And as I said, more recently, maybe in the last 3 years or so, you've heard, or we have heard, and we've seen the popularity of a drug called Molly increase. Molly is just powdered MDMA. Molly, I think, is meant to be short for molecule, and is meant to in some way suggest that while MDMA pills are kind of dirty and adulterated and not pure at all, if you buy Molly, you're getting the real stuff. You're getting the real pure MDMA powder, and that this should somehow be safer for you. I remember a couple of years ago reading a New York Times article about this, where the reporter interviewed people who used Molly, and all of them claimed that, well, I don't like to take dirty drugs. If you buy MDMA pills, who knows what you're getting, so I purchase Molly instead because it's just pure MDMA. Now, of course, that's absolutely not true. You can grind up a pill into powder, or you can make a powder that's a mixture of other random drugs. There's really no way to tell if the Molly powder that you're buying is in any way pure MDMA or not just a bunch of other drugs. And again, there's some interesting links I'll provide. Lately being in the last year or so, the drug which seems to be most commonly substituted in for Molly, or even just in pill form for MDMA, is synthetic cathinones, so bath salts that people are buying and using. So, history of MDMA is a weird history. It was a super popular and interesting drug for a while. It became incredibly illegal and has had this kind of mysterious life in real or adulterated form ever since. With all that in mind, what do we know about the current use of MDMA? Well, monitoring the future asks people about their use of ecstasy or MDMA. And keep in mind, someone who says they've used ecstasy maybe hasn't really. They've just used some other combination of drugs that were given to them in a pill or in a powder. But allowing for that, maybe 5 or 6% of 12th graders in 2014 said that they'd ever used MDMA. If we look at the trends over time, we see this kind of rise in the late 1990s, and then kind of a fall and kind of a leveling out in the 2000s. And you can see, at present in 2014, it's maybe 4 or 5% of people. This graph is slightly different than the figure I previously gave you, and I'm not honestly sure why that is. But you get the basic idea that the use of the drug is, not incredibly popular. By the way, another thing I don't like about this graph is that they fiddled with the y-axis, so to kind of exaggerate, I think, how high a climb, or how steep a climb there was in the popularity of the drug in the late 1990s. But bottom line is, it's not a very commonly used drug. A bit like the other hallucinogenic drugs, it's not as rare as, let's say, heroin, nor is it as common as, let's say, marijuana. And there's low to moderate, I guess, perceived availability of the drug. If we look at the risk associated with using the drug, we see a pattern that's similar to a lot of other drugs, where there's kind of a moderate assumed risk or perceived risk of using the drug, and kind of a generally high disapproval of using the drug, for whatever that's worth. We look at the National Survey of Drug Use and Health for the year 2013, and we ask about MDMA use among people who are age 12 or older. 6 or 7% of the whole population will have ever used the drug, which is, not too surprising. It's kind of about what we would figure. So again, it's not a very commonly used drug, nor is it incredibly rare. But again, anytime someone says they've used MDMA, there's a real question mark as to, did they really use MDMA, or did they just use some random mixture of other drugs that some unscrupulous chemists put together in a pill or in a powder and then sold. We don't know. They don't know. Anyway, what's the pharmacology of MDMA? Let's just talk about that really quickly. MDMA is water soluble. It absorbs pretty quickly into the body. That's not surprising. It was a drug that was designed to be used by humans and to be taken in pill form. It distributes rather easily through the body. The peak blood levels of the drug occur between 1 and 3 hours after ingestion, which is roughly about the time we get the peak effects that people report from the drug. Like other hallucinogens, it eliminates relatively slowly, or indeed, the effects of it kind of linger for 3 or 4 hours, not nearly as long as, say, psilocybin or LSD, not quite as short as, let's say, cocaine. Again, almost highlighting how MDMA could sort of be grouped in with the stimulants, it could sort of be grouped in with the hallucinogens. It's this weird sort of drug almost on its own. As I said now quite a few different times, there's a lot of variability in the sort of timeline of the effects of the drug, partly because when you take a pill of ecstasy or MDMA, or you sniff or eat some powder of Molly, you might be getting MDMA, you're probably getting a lot of other drugs. The amount of MDMA you're getting may be as little as none, so how quickly it's going to affect you or the types of effects you're going to have are really hard to predict for any one person at any one time. With all that in mind, what are the acute effects of MDMA as best as we know? Well, before the drug was made illegal, there was a fair bit of research on this, so we know what should happen when someone takes MDMA. We should see sympathetic activation. So again, this is a lot like stimulants because of course MDMA was developed as a stimulant. However, as I noted earlier in the lecture, it's not nearly so strong as the other stimulants. So we see increased heart rate and blood pressure, dilated pupils, elevated body temperature. That's all about the same, although not as strong as other stimulants. It's also similar to what we see with other hallucinogens. Note here, this idea of elevated body temperature can be dangerous. It's probably not dangerous if you're sitting comfortably in a room talking with another person or having a relaxing afternoon together. It could be dangerous if you're in a situation where you're already likely to be overheating. So if you're at a dance club or if you're at an outdoor music festival and you're dancing for long periods of time, even without drugs, you're probably going to get dehydrated and overheated. The drugs, whether they're stimulants or hallucinogens, are going to make that problem potentially a lot worse. And there's certainly some risk associated with using drugs under those settings, for the reason that you can overheat your body, you can dehydrate your body, your kidneys can start to fail, other organ systems can start to fail, and you can do yourself quite a lot of damage. In the central nervous system, MDMA affects the different aspects of the monoamine systems, meaning it affects dopamine, serotonin, and norepinephrine, basically stimulating the release of these neurotransmitters, blocking their reuptake, especially in sort of the frontal regions of the cortex and also regions of the limbic system. We have a very strong effect, or the drug has a very strong effect on emotions, especially strong positive emotions. It makes people feel happy. It also, interestingly, makes people want to interact with each other. So people who take ecstasy will report feeling very close and sort of loving and warm and connected to other people, even if those other people are strangers, just other people at the dance club or other people at the music festival who you really have no obvious connection to. If you take MDMA, you feel like, gosh, I love those people and they love me and we're all here together. Isn't that wonderful? Those are the typical anecdotal accounts you hear from people who take MDMA, or at least pure or real MDMA as compared to all the other random stuff that is in their pill. What's interesting though is we see some distortions of perception, so that's similar to the other hallucinogens, but not nearly so strong. So we don't see the really profound and strange changes in the way you view the world around you under MDMA that we would see under psilocybin, or especially under LSD or some of the other hallucinogenic drugs. So what about the chronic effects of MDMA? Those were the acute effects. What are the chronic effects that happen? What goes on if you take the drug over longer periods of time? Well, anecdotally, we hear accounts of changes in mood that can occur after people have used MDMA, at least in the short run after use. This is sometimes called Suicide Tuesday, meaning you go to a club or you go to a party on the weekend and you take ecstasy, but then by Monday or Tuesday of the following week, you feel kind of depressed. Now, this could be just you always feel sort of depressed on Tuesday because it's Tuesday, or it could be kind of a withdrawal effect from taking the drug. The high of positive feelings is balanced out by the low of negative feelings the next day on, or a few days on. It's difficult to study these effects right now because, again, MDMA is at this point in history illegal. So what research on MDMA typically does is it compares people who use MDMA to people who don't use MDMA. Rather than assigning people to use drugs or giving them drugs in a laboratory, you just go out and you gather a group of people, some of whom use MDMA on their own time, many of whom do not, and you in a non-experimental way can compare them. But these comparisons can be tricky because we typically see among people who use drugs in general higher levels of impulsivity and higher levels of negative mood. So to the extent that we observe the ecstasy users, people who from time to time use ecstasy in their life tend to have higher levels of negative mood, we don't know if that's because they use ecstasy or just because in general we find drug users to have higher levels of negative mood. This is that old correlation and causation problem that we encounter a lot in science. Does change in mood cause the differences in use? Does being kind of a somewhat depressed person make you want to use a drug that seems to take away those feelings? Or does using a drug change the way you feel? Or indeed, could both of those things happen? The bottom line is there do seem to be mood differences between people who use MDMA and people who don't, as there are between people who use drugs and people who don't, but we're not really sure what's the cause and what's the effect. One way to try and disentangle this is to follow people over time. That is, take a group of people and track them over time to see if, as some folks use more and more ecstasy, do their mood problems get worse? That would give us a sense of the relative cause and the relative effect of those two variables. And there is some research that's done this. It's tracked people over time, those who use ecstasy and those who don't. But the findings are fairly mixed. There's some research suggesting that there's increase in negative mood the longer people use ecstasy. There's some studies that find essentially no change or no difference. And this kind of is similar to the idea of the relationship between mental illness and use of ecstasy. We find higher rates of mental illness, particularly mood and anxiety disorders, among people who use who use MDMA. But it's interesting to note that those changes, those illnesses tend to precede use rather than follow it. So it may be the case that people who are anxious or depressed are attracted to using a drug that could change those feelings, at least temporarily. So this kind of course, raises the idea or the possibility that if there are changes in mood or if there are differences in mood, those could be reflected in terms of how neurotransmitter systems within the brain are changing while someone's using ecstasy and after they've stopped. So we know, or at least we think we know pretty well, how the short-term changes in mood that accompany ecstasy use occur. And I think I've used this image before in a previous slide, but or a previous lecture, but I'll use it again here. What we're pictured here is kind of a cartoon representation of a serotonin neurotransmitter system. So there's one axon of one neuron at the top, and then the dendrite of another at the bottom. You can see the dendrite has all these little serotonin receptors. The presynaptic neuron releases serotonin, those little purple triangular shapes, which drift across the synapse, interact with receptors, then pop back off, drift back across the synapse, and get recycled. And you can see this kind of little green molecule representation that's supposed to be the recycler or the reuptake mechanism. During ecstasy, part of what ecstasy does is it stimulates the release of serotonin and other neurotransmitters, but it also blocks that reuptake, that kind of recycling effect, with the result that during the period of time that someone's using ecstasy, there's a buildup of serotonin within the synapse, and lots of those receptors get activated very rapidly and very frequently, which is related, we think, to the changes in perception and changes in mood that occurred during acute or short-term, use of ecstasy. The idea is that after using ecstasy, in the days, hours and days that follow, a lot of the serotonin has been used up. It's kind of chemically degraded. It hasn't been recycled, so it takes a while for the presynaptic neuron to build up its store of serotonin again. And during that period of hours and days after use, there's less serotonin to communicate or to facilitate communication between the neurons, and there are decreased levels of activity in these neurotransmitter systems. So there's decreased mood. The world, which formerly seemed full of love and connection, now seems kind of cold and not loving and not connected, and people feel isolated and lonely. Again, this idea of Suicide Tuesday. That seems to be what occurs over the short term when someone is actively using the drug and maybe in the hours or days following drug use. And there is speculation that over long term, because of the repeated overstimulation of the presynaptic neurons, there's actual damage to them, and either the presynaptic neurons kind of break down and are less able to release serotonin, or even the postsynaptic neurons change their number and population of receptors, and the whole system becomes downregulated and even damaged over time from being repeatedly stimulated. This is the idea of long-term effects, long-term damage that might contribute to long-term changes in mood that could take place days and weeks and even months after use. Like I said earlier, some of this research is supported, or some of this idea is supported by research which seems to show changes in activity in the brain of users as compared to former users. So here we've got an image again from a PET scan that shows relatively diffuse activity in the cortex. That's the lighter colored purple. And then after use, after some period of use, there's a lot less activity. Again, suggesting that in some way ecstasy, as good as it may make you feel, is somehow damaging your brain, making it less able to do what it's supposed to do, perhaps especially to do the kind of emotional processing that it normally does when you interact with the world around you, and particularly with people around you. Now, it's important to say at this point that when we do neuroimaging studies, we have to be pretty careful about the way in which we make comparisons between, let's say, people who use ecstasy and people who do not use ecstasy, people before they've used ecstasy and people after they've used ecstasy. And some of the research that was funded and kind of promoted by NIDA back in the 1990s, the This Is Your Brain on Ecstasy research, has been criticized for really poor methodology, particularly comparing users to non-users without trying to control for the use of not just ecstasy, but the use of other drugs. So, for instance, in some of the research that was done, that you looked at human users and compared them to humans who did not use ecstasy, the people who used ecstasy also used a lot of other drugs like cocaine or methamphetamine, or just more alcohol, more tobacco. So it's possible that differences in brain activity could be related to the MDMA, but they could be related to other drugs or just other risk factors for being a drug user, like mental illness, for instance. It's not, it's tempting, and it was at the time, I imagine, very tempting for the researchers to conclude, aha, it's the ecstasy that's causing these changes in brain activity, particularly in regions of the brain that process emotions. But further review of this research and further consideration of it makes those conclusions suspect. It could be that MDMA was causing damage and decreasing activity, or it could be that a lot of other factors were leading to those effects as well. So to be clear, other labs that have attempted to replicate these findings in more recent years haven't been able to repeat them. So they have seen, in terms of when folks have tried to do research by more carefully comparing people who've used ecstasy to folks who have not used ecstasy, while trying to exclude people who use a lot of other drugs as well, and just get a more pure comparison of ecstasy versus non-ecstasy, the results don't seem to be nearly as strong. It doesn't seem to be the case that there's long-term changes in serotonin activity, and it's not clear that those effects that do occur are irreversible, that you somehow damage your brain if you use this drug, and the changes the damage or the changes can never be repaired. If you think back to maybe some of the early science classes you took in high school, or maybe even in junior high, you'll probably remember this idea as the idea of replication. We ought to be able to repeat a finding. Like if I have a laboratory and I do a study, an experiment, let's say, and I claim a particular finding, like ecstasy leads to change in this part of the brain, then you in your laboratory should be able to do the same thing. And if you can repeat my work and get roughly the same results, and if someone else can repeat the work and get roughly the same results, then over time, we as a group of scientists become more confident in the validity or the truthfulness of those results. If you can't repeat my work, if you make an honest effort and you still can't get the same results I got, and then maybe someone else can't get those results, and maybe someone else can't, then maybe it looks like I either accidentally or deliberately messed something up, and there really isn't an effect the way I thought there was. So to be clear, and to put this into context, some of the research, again, research that I remember from back in the 90s, that seemed to suggest that there were differences in the level of activity in the brain, especially activity in serotonin systems, especially serotonin systems that have to do with emotions, differences between people who used ecstasy and those who did not. A lot of that research hasn't really held up over time. And has caused some folks to question whether the risks associated with MDMA are as bad as perhaps they were initially thought of being. Now, some of the other research from back in the day that seemed to suggest damage associated with ecstasy use or MDMA use came from not human research but non-human animal research with rats, research with monkeys, etc. Now clearly, one of the advantages of working with non-human animals is you can more directly examine their brains. Rather than using a brain scan, you can simply kill the animal and cut open its brain and section it out. Here is an image that used to be on the NIDA website where serotonin neurons have been stained in this purple color. This is from an animal, I actually forget whether it's a monkey or a rat, under normal circumstances, after being given ecstasy 2 weeks afterwards, and then even 7 years afterwards. So it's probably not a rat because they don't live that long, so let's assume it's a monkey. And you can see the idea that's being suggested here is that ecstasy damages serotonin neurons in the short run, and that some of that damage can be repaired, but much of it can't, even many years after the fact. So again, this idea that that MDMA kind of damages or pokes holes in the brain, figuratively speaking, was supported from some of this research using non-human animals. Now, the tricky thing about research with non-human animals is, of course, dosing. Animals like mice or monkeys are smaller than humans, so figuring out what dose in animals corresponds to a comparable dose in humans is tricky. It's especially tricky with an illegal drug because, of course, we don't know how much of the drug users are using in their typical lives, because drugs are illegal, and we don't carefully regulate how much of ecstasy is in, how much MDMA is in the ecstasy pill that someone's buying and using. There can also be differences in terms of how the drug is used, whether the drug is injected in the case of animals or whether it's administered orally in the case of humans. And some of the research that was funded by NIDA and was published in the 1990s that looked at non-human animals and initially seemed to suggest this damaging effect involved monkeys who were not actually given MDMA but were rather given methamphetamine, and were given quite a lot of methamphetamine. So the damage associated with the drug may have had more to do with the damaging effects of meth use, especially at high doses, than with MDMA. This was actually kind of a controversial thing because the original research was published in the journal Science, which is an incredibly prestigious journal, and was later retracted because the researchers who did the study had to admit that, well, we made a mistake, or so they claimed. We didn't really give those monkeys MDMA, we gave them methamphetamine instead. So the damage maybe has nothing to do with MDMA at all. Now, to be clear, if you crack open any good pharmacology textbook nowadays, you'll see that there is evidence that, based on non-human animals, evidence that the MDMA itself, not just methamphetamine, but even straight MDMA, can be damaging to serotonin neurons. What is less clear is whether those damaging effects are irreversible. So some of the early concern about this, the dangers of the drug, the neurotoxic effects of MDMA, were not supported by research. But there is some more recent research that suggests there may be some deleterious or damaging effects of MDMA. It's just not clear how bad they are or how long lasting they are. And that actually leads me to my last part of this lecture, and I realize now, looking at the clock, it's a fairly long lecture, so if you made it this far, thanks for your attention. And that last part is just, what's the risk? What are the risks of using MDMA? Well, one risk associated with this drug is dosing, and this is generally true of all illegal drugs, because you just don't know how strong a drug you're getting if you're buying it illegally. If you buy a legal drug that's dispensed by a pharmacy with a prescription from a doctor, you know precisely how many milligrams are in your drug. I mean, even over-the-counter drugs. If you take Tylenol, you know how much acetaminophen is in each pill, and that's regulated by the government. If you buy a pill of ecstasy or a bag of Molly, or for that matter a tab of LSD, or even something like marijuana, you just don't know how strong the drug is. You don't know the concentration of the active chemicals in it. In the case of MDMA, it's especially bad because there are real questions about the purity of the stuff that you're buying if you're buying this drug on the street. There's ample evidence that most, or if not all, of a typical ecstasy pill is not MDMA, or a typical baggie of powder is not Molly, or Molly is not actually MDMA, but rather a bunch of other stuff, and who knows what that other stuff can be. And as we know, generally speaking, mixing drugs can produce unexpected and difficult and maybe even dangerous outcomes. So some of the risk of MDMA is really a risk that arises from the illegality of the drug rather than from the drug itself. Without being regulated, we just don't know what we're buying and we don't know what we're using. Another risk that occurs with this drug is the risk of hyperthermia and dehydration. Clearly people who use this drug, like people who use other hallucinogens, and especially like people who use stimulants in settings that are hot and crowded, where they're not drinking enough water, where they're exercising or dancing, can risk overheating their bodies and dehydrating their bodies, which can absolutely be lethal to do. There's also some risk for addiction to MDMA. Addiction in the sense of wanting to have positive feelings, pursuing, having the positive reinforcement of feeling good, feeling a loving connection to the world around you, and negative reinforcement, using to avoid the unpleasant feelings that you have when you stop using the drug. So can people overdose on MDMA? Absolutely. Can they become addicted to MDMA? Absolutely they can. It's not as rough and long-term a ride as other hallucinogens. There doesn't seem to be evidence that people become particularly addicted to psilocybin or to LSD. It seems possible, and there is evidence that people can become addicted to MDMA. And finally, as I said previously, there is this kind of open question about how damaging or not damaging serotonin, MDMA is to the serotonin systems of your brain. Most recent research suggests that damage can occur when you use MDMA. So if we look at good recent research that's well conducted with non-human animals, we see that MDMA damages serotonin neurons in different parts of the brain, and it makes sense that this damage could lead to cognitive impairment or mood impairment. What is less clear is how whether this type of damage would occur in humans, and if it didn't occur in humans, whether it would be permanent or whether it would be damage that the brain would repair over time. Again, with the drug being illegal, it's difficult to do research on it. It's difficult to know to a level of comfortable certainty how this would work in human systems. Although there is reason to be concerned, maybe even very concerned about the possibility of damage to the brain from this drug. Okay, so gosh, it's been a long lecture. I'm again looking at the clock and realizing it, so thanks so much for sticking with it. Preview for next time, we'll be talking about the opiates, a really wonderfully interesting group of drugs, at least to talk about. useful, I'm sure. Wonderful, I guess, under the right circumstances, but certainly wonderful and interesting and useful to talk about. So I'm looking forward to those lectures. Thanks for your attention. I really appreciate it. As usual, if you have questions about the lecture, put them in the comments section of YouTube, put them in the discussion boards of Blackboard. If you're on Blackboard, look for some links that I'm going to try and leave you to some really interesting videos and interesting information about MDMA and other hallucinogens. I think you'll find it very interesting. As I always say, thanks for your attention, and if you have a chance to step away from the laptop or the tablet and enjoy a bit of the day, please do so. Let this information sink in, and then when you're ready, come back, because I'll be here with another lecture. Thanks. Bye-bye.